My next guest on the program is the foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Thanks very much for joining me today. We spoke just before the polls closed in the British election. Now, you weren't in too much doubt about the results, so no surprise, I'm sure. What are your reflections, though?
Well, Tom, I think this is really an election result for the ages. A majority of 80 is the biggest majority in the British House of Commons for anyone since Tony Blair and for any Conservative since Margaret Thatcher. And it's actually bigger than it looks because Scotland is effectively out of play for both the Tories and the Labor Party, and so is Northern Ireland. So you're finding a majority of 80 across the whole of Great Britain established entirely in England and Wales. It's also the case that the media class and the London bubble absolutely despised Boris Johnson. And indeed, London, the majority of London constituencies, I think, voted Labor. So really, this is an incredible accomplishment by Johnson. And it makes him, I think, the strongest British Prime Minister since Tony Blair in his pomp. And that is a very good piece of news, not only for Britain, but for the Western Alliance and you know, for the whole cause of Western civilisation, I think, without putting too fine a point on it.
Well, indeed, there's a statement. It's actually fascinating on a sidebar to look at the majorities Tony Blair had. They were thumping ones, weren't they? They're not too distant past. But and in terms of those voters that voted for Blair and now voted for Johnson, the Labor voters, Greg, how does he hold on to them? Every person talks about governing for the whole country, but how does he hold on to the people that don't normally vote for him beyond Brexit? What's he going to do in that area? Well,
there are both technical and big political answers to that. Just to consider the Blair majorities for a second, Blair, of course, had the old Labor monopoly on Scotland, and there is a very significant anti-Tory gerrymander to the British electoral system. Blair, I don't think, ever scored a higher percentage of votes than Johnson got this time, or if so, it would be very, very marginal. Now, they've been trying to get a redistribution through the British House of Commons for a long time, and they've always been too weak, the Conservative governments, to do it. Johnson can do that if he wants to now, he won't gerrymander it in reverse, but if they just get an even distribution, you know, the same number of electors in every seat with a small tolerance like we've got in Australia, that in itself will massively assist Johnson's cause. If Scotland should secede, which I don't think it will, that would make it almost impossible for Labor ever to win government again. But you're right, though. The big question is, can he keep these working class voters? I was fascinated, Tom, by one northern voter who was interviewed, never voted Conservative before in his life, and he said in a thick northern accent he really couldn't abide Jeremy Corbyn once Corbyn refused to sing God Save the Queen. Now, the kind of the woke folk of London, they hate things like God Save the Queen. You know, it's anachronistic, imperialistic, chauvinist, nationalist, it's insensitive to our Muslim brothers, whatever. And of course, the divide between London and the rest is enormous. But you don't keep these folks if you don't perform for them. So Johnson has got to deliver results for them. He's got to improve the National Health Service, he's got to improve the economy, got to get more jobs into the regions. But this is a wonderful revolution in politics itself. As somebody else put it, since Blair, the only votes that were contested were middle-class votes. Now, working-class votes are contested. So Blair stole the middle class from the Conservatives. Johnson has stolen the working class from Labor. Now, this is not completely a one-off. The working class has been trending more Conservative over the last few election cycles, and they deeply considered voting Conservative last time, but May just couldn't close the deal. I was also fascinated, Tom, that although I admire him very much, Jacob Rees-Mogg and other sort of very conservative white Tories like Ian Duncan Smith and so on, very, very low profile during the campaign. Johnson had a huge profile, but so did Priti Patel, the Home Secretary of Indian origin, Sajid Javid, the Chancellor of Pakistani origin, James Cleverly, the Conservative Party Chairman of African origin. So having this really ethnically diverse Conservative cabinet which was not achieved through quotas or anything like that, and all of whom are tremendously patriotic Brits. They'll all stand up and sing God Save the Queen. They're tough on crime. They want to control the borders of Britain. That was no bar to getting white working class voters in the north. So it really is a values issue. This is a new Conservative Party which Johnson is pioneering. Fascinating to see if it's sustainable or not.
Yeah, and I guess further to that last question I asked, Boris Johnson still has to land Brexit. We know he's got the mandate, but that doesn't mean it's going to be simple. There's the Scotland issue as well. And then there's the frontline delivery. I mean, this was a big part of his acceptance speech even, you know, talking about nurses, doctors, and we know how close the NHS is to the collective bosoms of people in the UK. So is he almost the person that goes and, does he send out someone else to sort out Brexit so he can be the Prime Minister for home once again, rather than the sort of Brexit tour he's been having to do recently?
No, I think he's got to do both. All Western politics is trending towards the chief executive these days. I mean, ScoMo won the election almost on his own, really. I mean, Josh Frydenberg, Peter Dutton were important, but really it was ScoMo almost on his own. Trump won election, you know, with the dismay of 90% of his party. Obama was very dominant within his government. Johnson has to do both things simultaneously. Now, that is, deliver Brexit and deliver for northern and working class regional voters. The regional disparities in Britain are quite shocking in the sense that the overwhelming majority of culture money is spent in London. The overwhelming majority of transport money is spent in London. So the people in the regions have a legitimate gripe. On Brexit, Johnson is going a million miles an hour. He's announced today that he's going to pass a law which not only embodies his withdrawal agreement with the European Union, but makes it illegal for him to delay the final agreement with Britain beyond the end of next year. So they leave now at the end of January, and they have to have their final trading arrangement with Britain ready by the end of next year. Now, if the EU does what it always does, which says you've got to either do everything we want, have Brexit in name only, effectively stay in the union and pay all the money, even when you're theoretically out of it, or we won't give you a deal, Johnson is apparently willing to stare them down and say, well, guess what, we're leaving, we're having our final trade arrangement at the end of next year, and if you don't like it, we'll leave without a deal. Now, this is risky for Johnson, even with a parliamentary majority of 80, because the people just voted for Brexit to go away. But he believes that he can get the Europeans to the table this way. Now, up until now, the European Union has miscalculated everything spectacularly. If they'd given David Cameron some concessions when he asked for them, there never would have been a Brexit in the first place. If they hadn't humiliated May and given her nothing, they wouldn't have to deal with Johnson. It's an open question now, and it's very interesting. In the European papers today, lots of voices are saying, oops, maybe we miscalculated here. Maybe we need to think again. We need a partnership with Britain. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, well, the whip hand, I don't know if it's entirely changed, but, you know, Boris Johnson had this almost humiliating tour of Europe talking about Brexit. There was focus one day when he put his foot up on a desk because he shouldn't have. It was a French antique. So now he'll go back perhaps with at least a bit more respect. Greg Sheridan, thank you. We'll have to leave it there. I'm disappointed we didn't hear your northern accent there, but maybe next year. All the best over the break.
Thanks, Tom.
Merry Christmas.
Good Christmas.